Chapter 10 deals with improving communication climates. Communication climates have a lot to do with the emotional tone that we have in the relationships in our home or in our workplace or in our friendships. So let's get started. A communication climate deals with the emotional tone in a relationship. Basically, the communication climate deals with how people feel about other people in a work relationship or in a home environment. And generally speaking, there are a lot of emotional messages that people give to one another. And we're going to talk about each of the different types of messages that people can give, both in terms of messages that are confirming and positive, and messages that are not confirming and more negative. We can see the emotional climate that exists based on the verbal and the nonverbal communication that people use. And as I said a second ago, we can look at a work environment, we can look at a home environment. Generally speaking, if a work environment has more negative emotional communication climates, we would expect that people would feel more hostility, more tension, and more uncertainty. However, in a positive work environment or a positive home environment, we would expect that people would feel friendly, supportive, and kind. There is a major impact of a positive communication climate. First of all, positive communication climates predict marital satisfaction. Couples who are satisfied exhibit a positive to negative communication ratio of 5:1. What that means is that for every 5 positive verbal or nonverbal messages that people give to each other in the marriage or in the partnership, there is 1 negative message. However, couples that are not satisfied or that are dissatisfied tend to have a ratio of about 1:1, positive to negative communication. Positive climate issues also tend to predict family satisfaction. When parents give more positive messages to their children, siblings tend to have a more positive relationship with each other. That is probably not surprising to you. However, when parents do not give positive messages to their children, there tends to be a more negative communication climate, which is characterized by competition, hostility, and distrust. In addition to marital satisfaction and family satisfaction, we also know that a positive communication climate predicts job satisfaction and job retention. A positive communication climate tends to contribute to employees being more committed to their jobs and to their organizations. It also tends to enhance performance as well. In addition, educational satisfaction and success is also influenced by a positive communication climate, in that teachers who are positive tend to create students who have more success in their classes than teachers who use negative communication more frequently. So all of this demonstrates the extremely powerful impact that a positive communication climate has on satisfaction in the marriage unit, in the family unit, in employee organizational relationships, and also in school and educational situations. One thing that gets talked about a lot when we're looking at climate issues is communication that deals with either confirming or disconfirming messages. Messages that are confirming convey value about somebody. So when I give a confirming message to a student, what I tell them is, I value you. You're doing a good job in my class. I care about your well-being and your overall outcome. Confirmation messages also convey somebody exists, somebody matters to us, okay, and someone is important to us. And not just that the person is important to us, but also that their needs and their thoughts and their feelings are also important. However, disconfirmation is the opposite. When we use disconfirming messages, we convey disregard to people. We convey to other people, when we use disconfirming messages, that they are not important, that we don't like them or care. Confirmation messages take place through the process of recognition. When we recognize people, we demonstrate that we see them through using eye contact. We also use positive verbal communication, and we can also use positive nonverbal cues to convey that people matter to us. Things like smiling or using empathic nonverbal facial cues when somebody's talking about their feelings and giving them the message that we care about their feelings. These are all ways that we can convey confirmation through recognition. We can also convey confirmation through using acknowledgement. Acknowledgement takes place when we acknowledge that somebody has ideas and feelings that we see and care about and that we want them to express to us because we want to have them feel good about how they feel or what they're thinking or their place in our organization or in our family system. Acknowledgement also takes place when we engage in genuine listening and we abstain from judging. Acknowledgement also takes place when we use questions effectively, when we paraphrase to show that we've been listening, and when we reflect on someone's perspective. These are all ways that we can use confirmation. There are many situations where these kinds of confirming messages may be important, right? We can think about our relationships with family or friends. We can think about workplace relationships. We can also think about educational relationships and using confirming messages to enhance these relationships as well. Another way that we can show confirmation to people is by using endorsement. Endorsement deals with verbal and nonverbal agreement. It also conveys to people that they are important to us or that their thoughts or ideas are important. And it's important to note that you may not always have to agree with somebody in order to endorse their perspective. You can certainly acknowledge a perspective that's different from yours without having to have the same idea by saying something like, "Oh, I definitely can see your point on this issue," or "I see that this issue is important to you and I can identify that there are several aspects to your argument that make a lot of sense to me," right? So we don't necessarily have to have the same viewpoint in order to endorse. And it's important for us to remember this because endorsement is a major component of confirmation. In addition, we can use praise whenever possible. And you can think of praise or compliments as really the ultimate type of endorsement. Also, you can think about praise in terms of whether you're using it personally or publicly, right? The most major level of public endorsement would be to praise somebody in front of peers or in front of the family, right? So these are other ways that we can think about confirming messages. In comparison to confirmation, disconfirmation is the opposite. Disconfirmation may take place through several different types of communication behaviors. One of these is impervious responses. Impervious responses deals with ignoring other people. It can be very damaging, and it's actually sometimes more damaging than just disagreeing with someone's perspective. Impervious responses also tend to contribute to a chilly communication climate. As you all probably have experienced in your life, chilly communication climates do not feel good, it feels awkward, and generally speaking, people do not feel supported. Sometimes people go through having a chilly communication climate in their work environments. They may also go through it in their family systems. Sometimes it may happen more frequently in a blended family because you have different family systems that are merging. And sometimes there's a chilly communication climate that takes place in relationships, whether they be romantic or friend relationships or things like that. Another type of disconfirmation deals with verbal abuse. Verbal abuse is usually intended to cause psychological pain to the person who's on the receiving end. Typically, people who are verbal abusers do not just engage in verbal abuse once, but they tend to do it over time, over many different events. There is overt verbal abuse, where people are very explicit about their abuse. So they might say something to a romantic partner such as, "You'll never find someone who will love you if you ever leave." Or abuse can also be covert or sarcastic or through the use of malicious humor, as in the case of when maybe a husband says to a wife who struggles with her weight, "Oh yeah, you should definitely have another serving of pie, dear." And of course, he might be giving her a negative facial affect in the process, right? So covert sarcasm and malicious humor are just as damaging as overt, outright verbal abuse. And I encourage you, if you find yourself in a situation where somebody is using verbal abuse in the relationship, I encourage you to tell somebody else. I encourage you to discuss this issue with a trusted friend or parent or a professional counselor. And I encourage you to think about setting boundaries with people who are using these types of strategies so that you do not have to be on the receiving end of verbal abuse, because it's very damaging. And over time, people who use verbal abuse tend to get worse. They do not tend to get better. If you tend to find yourself using verbal abuse, I strongly encourage you to get yourself into some counseling so that you can learn about the things that cause us to learn these strategies, and so you can work to remediate this type of communication disconfirmation strategy. Generally speaking, people who engage in verbal abuse in their relationships do not tend to experience relationships that are satisfying and long-term, because generally people do not want to be around someone who abuses them. Another type of disconfirmation strategy deals with generalized complaining. Generalized complaining implies that another person has a lot of flaws in their character. People who use generalized complaining may be overcritical of another person. So they might be saying things like, you should clean up after yourself, or why are you such a slob? You always leave your stuff out, things like that. Or they may even say something like, why can't you be more positive? Or why can't you have a more positive attitude? Generally speaking, if you're always making negative comments to friends or family or partners, they are not going to feel confirmed. And likewise, if you have these kinds of comments being made to you, you are not going to feel confirmed as well. Another type of disconfirmation deals with interrupting. Interrupting is the process of beginning speaking before another person is finished. Interrupting also includes talking over another person when they are trying to say something. When we interrupt people, we indicate that we are not interested in what they're saying. It's very discouraging for someone who is attempting to share their thoughts and feelings, and it's highly irritating in addition to being disconfirming about the relationship. Another type of disconfirmation strategy deals with irrelevant responses. Irrelevant responses are comments that are unrelated to a previous statement that someone has made. So let's say your partner comes home from school and they say to you, I had a terrible day. And you say to them, oh, well, we need to go get groceries. So let's get in the car and go do that, right? That's obviously not a very socially or emotionally sensitive response when someone says that they had a terrible day, because the implicit statement in I had a terrible day is I would like some emotional support. So if you ignore the person's request for support by moving on to a different topic or trying to shift topics like that, it can be seen as very disconfirming. Another type of disconfirming response is tangential responses. Tangential responses are related to interrupting, but not the same. But basically what it is where we use somebody's comment as a starting point to talk about ourselves. So maybe somebody says something like, maybe they say something to their partner or a friend or something like, we need to talk about our holiday plans. And maybe the other person responds with, yeah, well, I need to figure out what my options are for the holiday. Can you search some info for me on that? So obviously, one response, we need to talk about holiday plans, is very collaborative. Like, we need to figure out what we're going to do. However, the tangential response to that is a very individualistic response in terms of what I need to figure out and can you do something for me, right? Another type of disconfirming response deals with impersonal responses or empty cliches. So let's say you have a friend that says to you, I'm so confused about this project. Or let's say I had a student say something to me, like, I'm confused about this project. And instead of giving them information, I responded with, yeah, well, confusion is a part of the process, right? That's obviously not a very helpful response. Another type of disconfirming response is ambiguous responses, because these have many meanings. So let's say you have somebody that you've been dating and you really like them and you ask them, can we meet on Saturday? And instead of giving you a confirming response, they say something like, probably See you later. That would leave people to be wondering what would be happening. They might wonder about the state of the relationship. So ambiguous responses have many meanings, and they generally convey disconfirmation to people rather than confirmation. Another type of response that's disconfirming is that of the incongruous response. Incongruent responses contain two messages that oppose each other. So, for example, let's say somebody says to another person that they're dating, right, or to a person that they're dating, "I love you." And the other person responds with, "Yeah, ditto." Now, obviously, these two types of messages are not the same, right? One person is being enthusiastic about conveying their affection. The other person shows hesitation and shows basically an unwillingness to respond to the showing of affection. So incongruous responses deals with a message that contains two messages that oppose each other, and generally that tends to convey disconfirmation. Now, sometimes defensiveness is a major part of a communication climate that's negative. So people become defensive for many reasons. One of the first of these is because they might need public approval, and when they feel like they are being put on the spot, or when they feel like their opinions or work or their stance on something is being called into question, it may make them feel defensive. So when we are defensive, it happens because we want to appear as the type of person that people approve of. Another reason why people get defensive is because they want to maintain a positive self-image. Generally speaking, we want to view and evaluate ourselves as being positive rather than negative. So sometimes when people feel defensive, they may respond in certain types of ways. Some of these responses include attacking the critic. So this could be verbal aggression, this could be blaming somebody, or topic shifting, switching topics. Attacking the critic may also happen based on sarcasm. So people may use really poor forms of jokes or humor that's actually very hostile. And this is one way that people respond defensively. Another way deals with distorting critical information. So people may rationalize why they do something that is an unhealthy communication behavior. They may try to compensate for what they did by engaging in other types of behaviors. So for example, maybe when somebody engages in defensive or verbal aggression in their marriage, for example, they may come home with a gift for the person to try to compensate that, okay? So distorting critical information, rationalizing, compensation are responses that people may use when they use negative defensive communication. And generally speaking, these types of defensive responses are not good. And also, people tend to regress. So people may make some positive steps towards more healthy communication, and then they may take 2 steps back, right? So anytime you're trying to change negative communication behavior, it does take effort and time and commitment to do so. And so the process of regression demonstrates that it's difficult to change negative communication behavior, but it is possible. People may also engage in defensive responses in order to avoid information that creates dissonance in them or creates a perception of conflict. So people may avoid in terms of physical avoidance of a person or a situation, but they might also repress feelings or thoughts or just not think about something that makes them feel bad. And this tends to create a perception of apathy in people or a negative attitude of really not caring about an outcome. So it's generally not a positive response to a situation, although it is normal and understandable. So what are some ways to minimize defensiveness in other people when we have the necessity to talk about certain types of issues which could provoke defensiveness? One of the ways to do this is to use descriptive language versus evaluative language. So we can use statements that use the word I instead of you. So a descriptive statement would sound like, I find myself feeling this way, whether it's sad or frustrated or whatever, when this happens, or when I find that I come home after a long day of work and the kitchen has not been cleaned up even though I left it clean, okay? So rather than saying, you are such a dirty person because you mess up the kitchen and leave it that way, what you want to say is, I find myself feeling frustrated and somewhat unloved when I come home after leaving the kitchen clean and the kitchen is messy. And I find that very frustrating. Okay, so you can see the tone difference in those two statements. And generally speaking, it's good for us to use I statements whenever possible and to avoid using you statements whenever possible, because you statements tend to provoke more defensiveness in other people. Another thing we can do is work on a problem orientation versus trying to have control over the situation. When we have a problem orientation, we are going to try to emphasize mutual satisfaction between us and other people. However, some people are very concerned with having control. And people who are concerned with maintaining control tend to like to impose their will or their wants or their needs on other people. Generally speaking, it is not good to come into a conversation or a relationship with a control-imposing attitude. Instead, we want to try to emphasize mutual satisfaction whenever possible. Another thing to think about is the idea of spontaneity versus strategy. Generally speaking, we want to engage in communication that is honest versus communication where there are secret motives playing out, where there's lying or deception or coercion or use of power or mismanagement of power, things like that. These are all things that we want to avoid. Other ways that we can minimize defensiveness in others deals with using empathy versus neutrality. When we show empathy through our verbal and nonverbal communication, we demonstrate to people that we care about them, that we're concerned about them. If we're neutral or don't demonstrate that we care verbally and nonverbally, then we indicate to people that we're indifferent to them, right? And generally speaking, it's always good to treat others the way we ourselves would want to be treated. Another difference in terms of minimizing defensiveness is to work to communicate with equality versus superiority. Equality messages convey that all of us have equal worth. However, superiority messages tend to convey that one person thinks that they're better than another person for various reasons. Another way to minimize defensive communication in others is to identify the difference between provisional conclusions versus certainty. When we make provisional conclusions, we are more likely to be able to modify those conclusions based on new information, and also it allows people to explain to us areas of confusion that maybe we haven't been understanding. However, if we claim to know exactly what somebody's thinking or to claim to know exactly what they're up to, and we haven't really talked to them much about what's really going on, then we run the risk of increasing defensiveness in other people because we're using an absolutist viewpoint rather than a tentative perspective. There are many different things that we can do in order to save face for other people. And generally speaking, when we talk about this idea of saving face, we're talking about the idea of maintaining respect for other people and allowing people to feel that they are respected in our communication. So we can do things like behavioral descriptions. So when you engage in these types of behaviors, I feel this way, okay? Rather than making broad statements about a person's character or their character flaws. Another thing we can do to save face is to use interpretation statements. So what I find myself hearing when you say that is this, am I understanding you correctly? Or you could say something like, from what I hear you saying, it sounds as if you're feeling this way and this is what you want to happen from the situation, right? And that way, if people have not conveyed effectively what they're really thinking, they can clarify it. Another technique for saving face is to share how you're feeling rather than talking about conclusions or judgments about other people. So you might say something like, this conversation is making me feel sad, rather than you're being such a jerk, okay? Obviously, telling someone that you're feeling sad is more vulnerable, right? But it also tends to minimize the likelihood that somebody will respond with an attacking statement. Another thing that we can do is to use consequence statements. So I find myself under this set of conditions feeling this way. It makes me wonder if maybe you're intending me to feel this way, or maybe you're feeling this way yourself. I find myself feeling sad about the conversation we're having, and I'm finding that the consequence of this is that I'm not wanting to spend very much time with you because of the way you're treating me, right? So these are different consequences. I tried to go through the behavior, interpretation, feeling, and consequence statement here in the last discussion here just a few seconds ago. So hopefully these are different techniques that we can use to save face, and hopefully they will assist you in the future when you're dealing with conflict in order to bring about a more collaborative perspective on dealing with it rather than evoking defensiveness. Another thing that we can do when we're saving face is to convey the intention. So after you describe behaviors and interpretations and how it makes you feel, and of course the consequence of the behavior and the feelings, then you can talk about what your intention is for the relationship. So my intention in this relationship is that we can both come into this interaction feeling mutually respected and feeling heard. And hopefully conveying intention statements like that will really bring people onto the same page as you, right? Because they might be able to see more clearly that you actually do have good intentions and that you are not intending to make them feel bad, but in fact you are intending to resolve an ongoing issue in the relationship so that you can improve the relationship. So we can think about all of these different techniques for saving face, and I encourage you to utilize them when you see fit. Non-defensive responses also tend to seek more information. And remember, a few slides ago I said that we want to seek to understand rather than jump to conclusions or seek to judge and conclude, okay? So it's always good to seek more information. So ask for specific information from someone. Ask them why they're feeling the way they're feeling. Ask them what you've done to make them feel that way or what you have done to contribute to the feeling, okay? Maybe sometimes you have to guess because people might not even know exactly what it is that's happening. So maybe you can suggest some possibilities for why it is that they're feeling the way they're feeling. You can also paraphrase by saying things like, from what I hear you saying, it sounds like you're feeling frustrated with my behavior. Is that true? Yes, that's true. Okay, so what are the behaviors that I'm doing that are making you feel frustrated? And these are ways that we can open up the dialogue between ourselves and others so that ideally we can work to create a more positive communication climate. Another thing that's very useful is to ask somebody what it is that they want. Okay, so you can ask someone, what can I do in this situation to fix the situation? Or what is it that you want me to do? What would make you feel better? Okay, or you can say something like, in the future, if we find ourselves in this situation, how would you like me to manage this so that you feel more respected or more validated or cared for? Okay, so ask what the critic wants. You can also ask about the consequences of your behavior. So when this happens, how do you feel? Or when this happens, what is the impact on the relationship or on you personally? You can also ask them if there's something else that's wrong. So chances are, if you are dealing with seeking information, it may not only be one issue that you're dealing with. So you can ask somebody, is there anything else that's going on that you'd like to share with me since we're talking about these various issues? These are all ways that we can communicate in non-defensive ways to hopefully contribute to a more positive communication climate when we do find ourselves dealing with some conflict issues. Finally, in order to engage in non-defensive communication, we can always choose to agree with the critic, right? Or agree with someone who's telling us what they think. Agreeing is a good way to make people feel validated and heard. And you don't always have to agree with everything they're saying, right? You can agree with certain parts of what they're saying and just not talk about the fact that you disagree. Or you could say something like, I do agree that the points that you're making are very important, and I think that we need to address these points. And then you can ask them something like, would you be open to hearing my perspective on this issue? And these are my thoughts on the issue, and what do you think about that? Okay, so you can agree with the facts, and you can also agree with the perception. So if somebody is feeling unheard or if someone is not feeling validated, you can agree with the fact that their feelings are valid, right? And remember, no one can tell you that your feelings are wrong, ever, because your feelings are your feelings. I tend to hear this in society a lot. You hear people saying things like, oh, don't feel bad or don't feel sad. The reality is that human beings are emotional creatures, right? So what this means is that we are going to experience a whole plethora of emotions and thoughts and perceptions throughout the course of our life, right? So the best thing that we can do, the best gift that we can give people that we love is validation. We can validate their thoughts. We can validate their perception. Even if we don't agree with their perception, we can still validate it by saying, wow, I can see how you would feel that way, or that's a very understandable viewpoint, or I could totally understand why you would feel that way in response to this issue, okay? And the other thing that we can do is we can validate feelings, okay? Feelings, meaning your feelings are valid. I understand that you're feeling this way. I'm sorry that you feel sad. I hope that I can fix something or make you feel better. I hope that we can learn to communicate in a way where we both feel validated and heard so that we can create a positive relationship and work on helping each other and supporting each other rather than competing or having to deal with these arguments, right? So there are many things that we can do in terms of our communication to contribute to a positive communication climate. We can engage in confirming messages, right? And when we hear somebody else engaging in disconfirming messages, we can refuse to take the bait. We can refuse to respond with disconfirmation, and instead we can talk about our preferred mode of dealing with conflict and the ways that we ourselves would like to be treated, right? We can talk about that. And we can agree with people's facts, and we can also agree with their experiences or agree with their feelings at least. You don't have to have the same perception or the same feeling as someone to agree with the fact that they have their feelings and that their feelings are valid. So in conclusion, I hope that this chapter has been useful in terms of understanding what a communication climate is, and also in terms of understanding what are some of the positive communication behaviors that contribute to a confirming communication climate, in addition to the less positive communication behaviors that contribute to a disconfirming communication climate. Generally speaking, human beings want to feel validated, cared about, and important. Whenever we engage in confirming communication, we are doing our part to create a positive communication climate so that all people in the interaction feel respected and validated. And this is a very central human need that all of us have. So let's think about our communication. Let's think about the things that we're doing that are confirming to other people that we care about. And let's think about perhaps some of the things that we have done in the past that are not confirming. And let's work on developing and increasing our tendency to be confirming and reducing the likelihood that we will disconfirm other people. As I always like to say, the golden rule is always a good thing to think about, right? Let's treat other people the way that we would like to be treated in life. And if you're doing your best to do that in all of your interactions, then you really can't go wrong. Thank you for your time and attention, and I will talk to you all in the next chapter.